Have you ever wondered what really happens when we die? Not the textbook answers, not the clinical definitions, but the real question we quietly ask ourselves in the middle of the night: do we simply vanish, or does the soul begin a journey far beyond this world? Carl Jung, one of the most influential minds in modern psychology, had a vision while standing on the very edge of life and death. A near-death experience that shook him to his core. And what he saw wasn't just mystical, it was deeply symbolic, eerily universal, and unlike anything science has ever explained. This wasn't a hallucination. To Jung, it was a message, an archetypal revelation from the unconscious, a glimpse into what may await all of us when the final moment arrives. And here's why this matters to you. Because what Jung experienced wasn't just about death, it was about life. About the parts of yourself you haven't met yet. The shadows you've avoided, the deeper truths you've buried under busyness and fear. What if death isn't the end, but a mirror reflecting back your truest self? In this video, we're going to take you deep into Jung's vision. A spiritual journey filled with ancient symbols, emotional revelations, and one powerful truth: that wholeness, not escape, is the soul's final destination. So if you've ever lost someone, feared your own mortality, or simply felt that life must be more than this endless routine, stay with us. Because what Carl Jung saw after death just might help you live more fully starting now. What happens when a man who spent his entire life exploring the unconscious suddenly crosses the boundary between life and death? In 1944, Carl Jung, then in his late 60s, suffered a massive heart attack. What followed was no ordinary medical emergency. For days, Jung slipped into a coma. But what he experienced in that state would leave him forever transformed. And not just him, what he saw has changed how many of us think about life, death, and the soul itself. He described it later in vivid, almost poetic detail. It was as if his soul had left his body. He saw the earth not from a hospital bed, but from space, floating silent, glowing blue. He wasn't dreaming. This wasn't the product of morphine or hallucination. Jung was clear. This felt more real than waking life, he said. He was fully conscious, but no longer bound by his physical form. Let's pause right there. Imagine seeing the earth from above, not in a satellite or a plane, but with your soul. Not as a tourist, but as someone standing on the threshold of eternity. Jung described a sense of profound freedom, a deep inner peace, and a release from all earthly obligations. No pain, no fear, just stillness and meaning. But here's the part that truly matters. He didn't interpret this as a random hallucination. To Jung, this experience was symbolic, even sacred. He called it a living symbol, something that carried layers of meaning far beyond words. And this is where we start to glimpse what made Jung different from others who've had near-death experiences. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He didn't return shouting about heaven or hell. He came back deeply moved, convinced that what he saw was not just personal, but archetypal. In other words, what Jung encountered was a universal map of the soul's journey, one that may exist deep within all of us. Let's reflect for a second. How would you feel if you suddenly saw your life, your planet, your entire existence from beyond? Would it terrify you, free you, change how you see your daily problems? For Jung, and the answer was clear, it changed everything. He spoke of a feeling that he was finally encountering the truth, not the truth told by philosophers or religion, but something that could only be known from that vantage point. He said, and I quote, "I had the feeling that I was about to understand everything, all at once." But just as he was ready to move further into that mystery, something pulled him back. He described a moment when he felt like he was standing before a great stone temple. Inside, he sensed the presence of timeless knowledge of sacred wholeness. But he was not allowed to enter, not yet. The message was clear. His time on earth wasn't finished. There were still things to learn, to teach, to integrate. His soul, though awakened, still had work to do. And then he returned, back to his body, back to the pain, back to the world of limitation, but also back with a new clarity, a kind of second birth, one that would shape the rest of his life's work. Now let's step back. This experience wasn't about bright lights or angelic voices. It wasn't dramatic in a cinematic sense. But in a deeper symbolic way, it was radical. Because Jung saw death not as an ending, but as a continuation of inner evolution. A place where the soul doesn't disappear, but meets itself more fully than ever before. And that leads us to a powerful insight. Maybe the purpose of life isn't just survival success or even happiness. Maybe it's integration. Maybe it's becoming whole, so whole, that when the moment of death comes, we're not afraid. Because we've already met our soul. So here's the question I'll leave you with for this part of the video. What would you see if you looked at your life from outside of it? From above, from eternity, would it make sense? Would you feel peace, or would you feel there's something unfinished, some part of yourself still waiting to be found? This is just the beginning of Jung's vision. And in the next section, we'll follow him deeper into the sacred temple he saw in that other world, and what it revealed about the self, the shadow, and the soul's true journey beyond death. Stick with us, because this is where things begin to shift from personal to cosmic. After floating above the earth, after feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, Carl Jung saw something even more extraordinary. Something that felt like the center of all meaning. A temple, but not one made by human hands. This was an ancient, eternal structure, radiant, still indescribably sacred. Jung didn't describe it in religious terms. There were no angels, no judgment, no golden gates. But there was something unmistakably powerful about it, something that called to the very essence of his being. To Jung, this temple symbolized the self, not the ego, not the personality, but the true self, the soul's deepest core. The unchanging center behind all masks, all stories, all striving. And in that moment, Jung knew this place wasn't just outside of him. It was within him. Let that sink in for a moment. This temple wasn't just a destination after death. It was a reflection of the soul's inner architecture. A place only accessible to those who had truly become whole. He sensed that only those who had faced their shadow, embraced every part of themselves, light and dark, and integrated it all, could enter. Not because someone was guarding the door, but because wholeness is the key. Now ask yourself, what parts of your soul have you left outside your own temple? What have you not yet accepted, forgiven, or reclaimed? This is what Jung was beginning to understand, not as a theory, but as a lived revelation. And yet, as he moved closer to the threshold, preparing to enter this sacred space, he was stopped. Not by fear, not by force, but by a quiet, undeniable message. Your time is not yet. You must return. Jung described this moment with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. He felt a deep longing to remain, to step inside, to finally complete the journey he had been on his entire life. But he also understood there was a greater will at play, a force beyond intellect or desire, what he called a metaphysical imperative. He realized he still had something to do back on Earth, something unfinished, some part of his purpose that required returning to the human realm, to the pain, the imperfection, the body. Imagine how difficult that would be. You've just tasted ultimate peace. You've seen the soul's sacred home, And now you're being asked to go back into the mess, the struggle, the noise. But Jung didn't resist. He knew just as many mystics and near-death experiencers have shared that true awakening isn't about escape. It's about integration. It's not about running toward the light. It's about bringing the light back with you into the ordinary, into the wounded, into the forgotten corners of your everyday life. And that's exactly what Jung did. When he awoke, he was changed. He no longer saw life as something to master or conquer. He saw it as a preparation, a sacred process of becoming whole enough to one day reapproach that temple and finally step inside. That image stayed with him until his death. He would later write that the goal of life is not happiness, not success, not even peace, but wholeness, to become a soul that no longer fears its own reflection, a soul that knows its purpose and entrusts its return. Now here's where this gets deeply personal. This vision wasn't just about Jung, it was about you and me, and anyone who has ever felt like they were on the outside of something sacred. Looking in, we all have a temple inside us, but not all of us are ready to enter. So I'll ask you, if you stood before that threshold today, would you be allowed to step through? Or would there still be something in you asking to be healed, accepted, brought back from the shadows? This is the heart of Jung's message. Not that we should fear death, but that we should use this life, to prepare, to become so real, so whole, so inwardly integrated, that when the moment comes, the temple doors no longer feel foreign, they feel like home. You've left your body. You're no longer bound by time, identity, or gravity. And in this vast, in-between space, something begins to appear. Not just light, not just peace, but images powerful, vivid, unforgettable. A temple, a glowing corridor of stone, a guide or guardian waiting in silence. A presence of light, not a being, but an energy you somehow recognize. Carl Jung experienced these symbols during his near-death journey, and here's the key. He didn't dismiss them as random visions or drug-induced hallucinations. He saw them for what they were, archetypes. Now, what are archetypes? They're not characters. They're not myths. They are primordial patterns, spiritual blueprints embedded deep in the collective unconscious of humanity. According to Jung, these symbols, temples, corridors, guides, lights, aren't just personal. They show up in ancient myths, sacred texts, and modern near-death accounts across cultures, religions, and eras. Think about it. People from vastly different parts of the world, some who never read a spiritual book, report seeing the same things during near-death experiences. A being of light, a tunnel or passageway, a life review, a sacred space. A choice between staying or returning. Is that coincidence? Or could it be evidence that these images exist inside us all, waiting for the moment the ego finally lets go? Jung believed it was the latter. To him, death doesn't introduce the soul to something foreign. Death strips away everything false so we can finally meet what's been waiting inside us all along. Let's go deeper. In his own vision, Jung felt he was not traveling in space, but moving inward closer and closer to a core of truth. And the symbols he encountered, especially the temple and the light, were mirrors of his inner journey toward wholeness. He called these archetypes psychic truths. They are not literal, but they are real as love, fear, memory, or meaning, and perhaps more enduring than anything we see in physical form. Now here's where it gets even more fascinating. Jung proposed that after death, the soul confronts its own symbolic landscape, a psychological mirror. Not a punishment, not a judgment, but a deeply intimate unveiling. We don't face a God with a list of sins. We face ourselves, our shadow, our unlived life, our wounds, our essence. And in that confrontation, the symbols that arise aren't random. If you lived avoiding your inner truth, maybe you see a labyrinth. If you spent your life seeking answers, perhaps you find a library of light. If you ran from your shadow, you may find it waiting at the threshold of your final awakening. But the most powerful part, Jung believed that these archetypes aren't there to punish us. They're there to guide us, to help us finish the integration we couldn't complete while in a body. And this isn't just poetic psychology, it's reflected in cultures around the world. In Tibetan Buddhism, the bardo is a realm the soul passes through after death, encountering symbolic visions and deities, many of which are terrifying or ecstatic, depending on the soul's readiness. In ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead describes gates guardians and a weighing of the heart not as judgment, but as symbolic encounters with truth. In Christianity, the idea of a tunnel of light and meeting a divine presence has been reported by countless modern near-death experiencers, even those who had no prior belief in the afterlife. What do they all have in common? Symbol, light, shadow, transformation. And what if? Just what if? These are not cultural projections, but deep-seated soul codes. Messages the unconscious tries to speak through dream, myth, and finally through the sacred threshold of death. Jung believed that death reveals, not erases. It reveals what we've carried in the unconscious all along. It brings every part of us into the open, especially the parts we tried to forget. So now let me ask you, if you were to die tonight, what symbols would appear in your vision? A locked door, a familiar figure from your past, a dark tunnel, or a wide open garden? Would your soul be greeted or challenged? This is not a question of belief. It's a question of preparedness. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Perhaps death is the moment that everything unconscious becomes conscious all at once. And perhaps the greatest mercy is that these symbols come to guide us, not to frighten us, to show us what we still need to embrace. So that maybe in another lifetime or in another plane, we can walk into the light, not as a fragmented self, but as a soul finally whole. This is why Jung's vision still speaks to our modern lives. Because even if we're not facing death today, we are all in some way walking through our own symbolic corridors. Through grief, through loss, through personal transformation, the same archetypes that meet us in death, whisper to us in dreams, call to us in crisis, appear in the mirror when we finally stop running. So maybe the real question isn't what happens after we die, but rather, when Carl Jung awoke from his near-death experience in 1944, he didn't come back the same man. His body was still weak. He was bedridden for weeks. But something inside him had been radically transformed, something he couldn't quite explain in words. He had just stood at the threshold of death. He had seen Earth from the outside, glimpsed a sacred temple of the self, and encountered symbols so ancient, so deeply embedded in the soul, they shattered everything he thought he knew about life. And now, he was back. But here's what's extraordinary. Jung didn't return with fear. He didn't speak of hell or punishment. In fact, he no longer feared death at all. What he feared was something far more profound. "I am not afraid to die," he said. "I am only afraid of dying without having truly known who I am." Let that land for a moment. Because how many of us live our whole lives just skimming the surface, moving from task to task, role to role, never truly asking, who am I beneath all this? For Jung, this question became urgent, vital. Not something to ponder later in life, but something that should guide every decision, every relationship, every inner struggle. He came back with a mission, not just to live longer, but to live deeper. And from that moment on, his work changed forever. Before this experience, Jung had already explored dreams, the unconscious, and mythology. But after it, his focus became more spiritual, more existential. He began diving deeper into concepts like the self, the true center of your soul beyond the ego and the masks we wear. The shadow, the parts of you that you hide, repress, or deny, and yet are vital for your healing. Individuation, the sacred journey of becoming whole, of integrating every fragmented part of yourself. This wasn't just theory anymore. It was embodied, urgent. He had seen what happens when we die. And he knew that death was not an escape, but a mirror. A mirror that shows you whether or not you've lived in alignment with your soul. So the question became, how do we prepare for death? By how we live. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of life isn't pleasure, status, or success. It's self-realization. Not in a selfish sense, but in the sense of becoming fully conscious of who you truly are. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And here's what's hauntingly beautiful about that idea. You don't need to wait for a near-death experience to start. You don't need to almost die to wake up. Because everything Jung discovered on the edge of death is available to you right now if you're willing to look inward. But let's be honest. Most people don't want to look. It's easier to distract ourselves, numb out, stay busy. It's painful to confront the shadow. It's disorienting to let go of the old identity and move towards the unknown self. But Jung made it clear that's the work. Not outer success, but inner integration. Not having the answers, but being courageous enough to ask the right questions. What part of myself have I ignored for years? Who would I be if I stopped pretending? What am I here to learn, heal, or transform before I leave this world? These are not easy questions, but they are essential. Because according to Jung, death is not the end, it's a return. A return to the deepest part of who you are. A stripping away of all that is false, so the soul can finally stand in its own truth. And here's something he hinted at, again and again: the soul knows when it is not living its truth. And it will show up through dreams, symptoms, relationships, crises, until you listen. That's why this video matters. Not to sensationalize Jung's vision, but to invite you, yes, you watching this right now, to take your soul seriously. Because you don't need to see a sacred temple in a coma to know it's real. You've probably felt glimpses of it already. In a moment of silence, when something stirs inside you. In a dream that won't let you go. In a deep grief or a sudden awakening that shakes the foundations of your identity. That's your soul speaking. That's the beginning of individuation. That's where the real journey begins. And maybe that's how we prepare for death, not by fearing it, not by avoiding it, but by living in such alignment with who we truly are that when death comes, we don't resist, we recognize. We recognize the symbols. We recognize the light. We recognize ourselves. Because we've already been doing the work, right here, right now. So ask yourself, what do I need to remember about who I am? Before it's too late to return. In the world we live in today, where every second is filled with noise, distractions, deadlines, and dopamine hits, it's easy to forget one of the most important questions we can ask: who am I? Really not your job title, not your social role, not your follower count, your trauma history, or your 5-year plan. I'm talking about something deeper. Carl Jung's near-death experience was more than a spiritual revelation. It was a reminder. A reminder that we are souls first, not just consumers, employees, or even thinkers. And that reminder might be more needed now than ever. Because let's face it, in a culture obsessed with productivity, perfection, and endless progress, more and more people are quietly feeling disconnected from each other, from purpose, from themselves. Have you ever felt that? That strange hollow ache? Even when life looks fine on the outside, like something in you is homesick, but you don't know what, for Jung understood that feeling. And through his experience, he showed us that this ache isn't a flaw. It's a signal, a spiritual GPS saying you've wandered too far from your center. And here's the beautiful part, that you don't need to die to find your soul again. You don't need to see a glowing temple or float above earth. All you need is to pause, to listen, to let go of the performance and begin a quiet conversation with what's underneath it all. That's what this video is inviting you to do. Not to blindly believe in Jung's vision, not to adopt someone else's version of truth, but to remember your own. Because the truth is, we all come into this life with questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where will I go when it's over? And most of us are taught to ignore those questions until it's too late to ask. But Jung believed that the soul is always whispering. Even when the world is loud. Even when we've forgotten how to listen. So let me ask you this. What if the loneliness you felt isn't emptiness, but a doorway? What if the anxiety isn't dysfunction, but the soul trying to break through the noise? What if your longing for something more isn't a problem to fix, but a calling to follow? Jung's experience doesn't offer us dogma. It offers a map, a way to start finding our way back to what matters. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Because one day we'll each reach that threshold, that moment between this world and the next. And when that time comes, we won't take our resume, our achievements, or even our beliefs with us. We'll only carry one thing, who we've become inside. So the real question is not what happens after we die, but rather, will I be ready to meet myself when that moment comes? That's the invitation Jung leaves us with. And maybe that's why you're here right now. Carl Jung didn't just catch a glimpse of death. He saw something far more powerful. He saw the meaning of life reflected inside death's silence. And that's what makes his experience so unforgettable. Because what if the greatest lesson isn't about where we go when we die, but about who we become while we're still alive? Jung returned from the edge, not terrified, but awakened. He came back not preaching doctrine, but offering insight. That the soul has its own logic. That the unconscious is not just a vault of hidden fears, but a sacred map, a map we were never taught to read. So here's the truth. You don't have to wait for a near-death moment to begin. You don't need to hit rock bottom or face the end to hear your soul's voice. The journey starts the moment you decide to look within, to turn down the volume of the world, and tune in to the symbols, the feelings, the quiet whispers that have always been there. Because the question isn't, what did Jung see? The real question is, what part of that vision is calling to you? Maybe it's the temple you've always known existed inside you, but haven't dared to enter. Maybe it's the longing to be whole, to stop running, to stop pretending. Maybe like Jung, you're starting to realize that death isn't a finish line, it's a return to essence, to truth, to self. And that means every day you ignore that call is a day your soul quietly waits. So don't wait. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to begin asking better questions. Who am I? Really? What parts of me have I left in the shadows? What truth have I been afraid to claim? This isn't about fear. It's about freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not from escaping death, but from living with presence, with depth, with courage. So, let me leave you with this. Jung didn't just face death. He walked away with a deeper reverence for life. And now, that vision is in your hands. What will you do with it? Comment below, do you believe death is an end or a return to something greater? And if this stirred something within you, hit subscribe to join us on this journey of soul-awakening psychological depth and inner transformation. Because the next video might not just inform you, it might remember you to yourself.